with the US Army. So I'll turn it over to Paul. Thank you, gentlemen, both.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to everyone at New America for hosting this event today, and thank you all for sticking it out to the end of the day. Just one short plug for the University of Texas at Austin. In our last panel, we heard about the need for greater education in the field of national security affairs, and that's exactly what we're trying to build at the UT system, especially under Chancellor William McRaven's leadership. So if you have an opportunity to learn more about what UT is doing, one of our flagship efforts is to create a new journal called the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. So we'd love for you all to be readers or even contributors to TNSR. That's just one example of how we're trying to make UT an institution that supports training the next generation of national security leaders. All right, that's my pitch. I'm done. Again, thank you, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here with us today. We heard from Dr. Abdullah earlier today about some of the current situation in Afghanistan. I wanted to ask briefly for your take on one or two things that Dr. Abdullah touched on, and then maybe talk more about Afghan foreign policy. Can you give us a sense about the National Unity Government in Kabul? Dr. Abdullah, I think, was fairly sanguine about it. We've seen some headlines that are a little troubling. Some of President Ghani's political opponents have put out a statement demanding some reforms. How worried should we be about the political situation in Kabul right now? Is there any danger that the government there will be unable to continue on with the counterinsurgency campaign or continue to be a partner with the international community?
Thank you. First of all, thanks to the New America Foundation, and thank you for accommodating. I know we changed this several times. We had, as you know, a visitor from Kabul. Dr. Abdullah was here in town, so we tried to get here. But I'm glad that at the end of the day, if we have these people, they're the most committed ones here, right? To be here at the end. As for the government of national unity, or any government, as democracy is difficult. There is opposition. We plan to have a democratic government in Afghanistan, a government where their voices can be heard and people can air their concerns, have oppositions to the government's take or any other. And we're pretty successful at making that happen. It's one of the freest media. People can talk, but it shouldn't be a concern. The fact that people are doing means that we have created, and our experiment has succeeded. If it was, the aim was to create an authoritarian regime where people do not oppose a government's view, then maybe then we should have been concerned. All of these are democratic voices. They're civil in their process. I think we don't see it as a matter of fear. We see it as something that the government needs to work with to address concerns that may exist and be able to clarify where there are questions. And reforms are not easy. You know how difficult Afghanistan had it started in 2014 when the National Unity Government began. We were at the bottom of the World Corruption Index from a Transparency International's perspective. And today we have made 4 points jump, and that has not been easy. It meant that some powerful people with deep pockets had been hurt. And so there will always be resistance, but there is steadfast commitment from the government and from our international partners to see it through and to make Afghanistan the self-reliant country that we've all fought for.
And you mentioned the international partners. What would you most like to see the international community do right now to help support the government in Kabul, both in its counter-corruption campaign and with regards to the upcoming 2019 presidential elections? What role should the United States and the international community play?
First and foremost, have the confidence that we are on the right path. Afghanistan, from a security standpoint, still needs support from the international community. But as we make progress each day, we're building our own security forces to be able to do that job on our own. I get that question quite often on how long we need that support for. But it's already in this current compact that we have with the United States, the 4-year security plan that will help us double our special forces integrate some of the fighting forces from the Ministry of Interior into the Ministry of Defense, streamline those activities, and improve the logistical capabilities and some of the needs of the military that needs to be able to do its communications better. At the same point, the Afghan Air Force is in the process of being built. By 2023. We will have 314 aircrafts available for the Afghan Air Force that will allow us to do the airlift and do the surveillance, everything that we currently rely on the international security forces to do. We will have that. Our economy, despite all of what we endured in the last 2 years with very little help, and all of the offensive attacks, but the Taliban and other enemies, we were able to improve the Afghanistan's income, and we started off being in deficit. The National Unity Government, when it took over, we were asking the international community to fund our own revenue, to fund, we couldn't fund our own operations, and now it's not only doing that for the past 2 years consistently, we have been meeting our target of revenue collection far before the year ended. And this is unique. So we are on the right path. I want to say that even in the 8 weeks since the new strategy has been announced and we have had extra additional air support, the Taliban's activity has already changed in its nature. They have gone back to their old tactic of small groups, attack and run operations, rather than fighting like conventional military that they did in the last 2 years. So one of the things that really hurt us in the previous 2 years was the lack of air support, and also meant the lack of having eyes on the ground. We had no battlefield advantage over the Taliban. They could gather in large numbers, in the hundreds, and overrun a district that was protected by, let's say, 10 or 20 security officials who were vastly outnumbered, even if they were larger. And since we didn't have eyes on the ground, we had no battlefield advantage. In fact, the Taliban had, because we were in uniform and they were not. Since this operation has started, they have once again seen that they are being targeted, and they started going the small numbers, which means the checkposts and people out there in the outposts can now defend against it and free up the rest of our security forces to get engaged in offensive operations. So we see Afghanistan going on a very positive track, and if let's assume in a few years, once we have conducted or completed all of this, the Afghan security forces will be able to do all of what it does on its own. So we are on the path to success. I just want the international community and our partners to know that that is happening, because the people who are working with us at the Resolute Support know that, but many in Washington who are observing don't often realize that that is happening, because people give this argument that, well, what can 3,000 more troops do with that 150,000 troops couldn't? They don't take into account the Afghan security forces on their own.
Thank you for that. And let me start by saying I've been a big supporter of sustaining American commitment to Afghanistan over the years. But let me, for a moment, pretend I'm not. And let me play devil's advocate if I could. You said we're making progress. But we've heard that. We've been hearing that for 16 years. We've been hearing, oh, we're making progress. And I think there's many American people who want to know when will it be enough? When can we go home and say we've accomplished the mission we set out to accomplish? When can we say the Afghan army is ready? Is it next year? Is it 4 years from now? President Obama had actually hoped to end the mission at the end of 2016, and he reversed himself in the last year in his administration. And now President Trump has essentially opened up an open-ended commitment to Afghanistan. So again, for those Americans who are wondering, when is it enough? What would you say to them?
Well, let's put it this way. You are already home. The fact that you have advisors in Afghanistan is no different than to you having advisors anywhere else in the peaceful world, in Germany and other places. Do you consider that being a way? there are no body bags coming back to the United States, but we, the Afghans, are taking that brunt of the fighting. You're not involved in a combat operation. By large degree, all of the operations are in support of our own security forces. So instead of looking at it from a perspective of when can you go home, I think it is to say that Afghanistan continues to stand with the United States in our mission to eradicate terrorism from that part of the world. We are with you. This is a partnership. And I think together we are doing a great job at making sure that we bring stability to that entire region. And we are hoping that some of our regional partners will also realize that that is what's happening, and we're together working very closely with to create that consensus in the region too. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for letting me push back a little bit. And for the record, I entirely agree with you, and hope that the American people hear that message more often than they do. Speaking of the kind of the regional situation, one of the endpoints to this conflict that we often hear of is the possibility of a negotiated settlement with the Taliban. Earlier today, Dr. Abdullah said, I think wisely, that he can't start detailing what the negotiating positions ought to be. But does the government of Afghanistan have a view as to who ought to sit at the table for those negotiations? Should it be a negotiation between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban alone? Does Pakistan need to have a seat at that table? Does the United States need to have a seat at that table? The United Nations? Who should be at the table during these negotiations?
Well, we can't look at it from a black and white perspective. Taliban is not a homogeneous group. There are several different factions within the Taliban, and not all of the commanders agree on what their mission is and whether they want to negotiate. So if we do want to put it in a maybe binary perspective, there will be the reconcilables and the irreconcilables. And if we look into the irreconcilables, there are many of those groups that include criminals, those who are allied with foreign terrorist groups, those who are benefiting from illegal mining and logging, and all of the different groups that include. Those are the irreconcilables that we will have to deal with in the manner that that group needs to be dealt with. If it's a terrorist, kinetically, if these are criminals, through law, and whatever their grouping is. And if they're foreigners, they need to be sent back, and we need to make those arrangements. When we come to the reconcilable groups, those who want to negotiate peace, our doors have always been open to them, and we'll continue to keep them open. And again, it's not a simple process. Every group has a different agenda, perhaps different grievances that needs to be addressed. And we're dealing with it as it is, as a complex matter, and all of the entire government is involved in making that happen. Those who need to have talks with our the High Peace Council, those who are reconciling and want to talk to and what that prospect may look like, they can go that path. There are those who need to have more discrete discussions with the intelligence agency, they do that. And so there are various paths open to those who want to negotiate. And all of them are always open and will continue to be open. But I must say, we're negotiating because that is what we want, because we want peace, and we want to ensure that everybody in Afghanistan has a right. This is a system, and we want an inclusive society and inclusive government. We're not going to negotiate from a position of weakness. I think the world needs to understand that in the last 2 years we made huge sacrifices, 75,000 casualties in 2 years alone. But it didn't put us on a back foot. Our resolve continued to be strong, because the people who we are fighting with are terrorists who want to bring and want to destroy it, not just us, but have ambitions far beyond that. Those who made the arguments that perhaps they're only fighting because there is a foreign occupying force, well, for the last 2 years they weren't. In many of the provinces, including in Helmand, no foreign forces. There were Afghans that they were killing. There were Afghans that they were killing in the mosques. There are Afghans that they were killing at banks, and queues and lines elsewhere across the country. we are committed to fight terrorism with everything that we have. Those who have grievances that we can address, we're open to talking to them in however format and whatever format they want to talk, whether they want to talk in Kabul or remotely, we'll be happy to do.
You mentioned reconcilables versus irreconcilables. A year or so ago, the government of Afghanistan reconciled with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. How was that received by the Afghan people? Was that welcomed, or was any opposition to that? And could that be a model for future reconciliation efforts with other militants?
Well, first of all, there was mixed reactions, as it always will be, as expected. Some welcomed it because it's a peace process and it brings in an insurgent group, and instead of having them on the opposite, fighting us and sitting somewhere else abroad, sending us violence, to have them in Kabul and have them engaged, talking to the various groups in Afghanistan, and to reach their political ambitions through the diplomatic means that we do have open for them. And it has been a successful experience. Others who want these people to be punished or not be to not have that civil life were opposed to it. There is mixed reactions. It's a country that went through 4 decades of violence. Everybody has their own feelings about certain groups that at whose hand they have suffered. Yeah. But largely seen as a positive thing to do. As the chief executive said, the vast majority of Afghans want peace and stability, and they understand that to do that we would have to reintegrate and reconcile with some of the groups that may have whatever grievances they may do, political, social, economic, and to have that taken care of. Yeah.
Let me just ask one more question, and then we do have some time for a couple of questions from the audience. Stepping back from the current conflict, can you give us a sense of what Afghanistan's foreign policy priorities are more broadly? Of course, there's the relationship with donors, there's the negotiation issue with the Taliban, but more broadly, what does Afghanistan, how does it see its role in the world and its role in the region? Thinking, especially since 2001, a few things have changed in the world. China has continued to rise. We've had sort of ups and downs in Kyrgyzstan next door. So again, what does Afghanistan see its role in the region and in the world?
Well, we see ourselves as the natural roundabout of Asia, between Central and South Asia, and the vision we have for the country is a place where people, ideas, and goods flow freely. Sorry, it has been the end of the day. So we want to be an enabler to unlock the potential of Central Asia. In many ways, we have kept them from their own development and progress. And we also want to be the connector for South Asia to be able to have access to the vast resources that Central Asia has. But to play that role that Afghanistan has played historically, to be the connecting melting pot where everybody comes together and be a source of prosperity. But we also see ourselves beyond the region with the rest of the world, including our fundamental partner, the United States, our NATO partners, the Europeans, and others who have made sacrifices in Afghanistan to strengthen the ties that we have built with them over the past 16 years and build upon them, so they can also see Afghanistan as a place where they can do business, not just with Afghanistan, but the region. We see ourselves as, like I said, a potential opportunity for everybody to prosper.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to hand over the floor to questions from the audience. We do have just about 10-ish minutes for a short discussion. So, yes, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, for coming. Brian Williams. I've written a book, Afghanistan Declassified, based on my trips in Afghanistan. And one thing I always heard when I was there is that the roots of the problems in Afghanistan come from Pakistan. Over and over again, that was a common theme. And certainly, it's been stated that the Haqqani network is an asset of the ISI. Open secret that the Taliban are based in Wana and Miran Shah and Quetta. They have rear staging grounds and bases and depots. And recently the Trump administration came out and chastised for the first time Pakistan for being a base for terrorism. Do you applaud this statement? And what's your view about the Haqqani network being based in Pakistan? And if you could speak to the ISI right now, their chief, what would you say about having this meddling in Afghanistan by the Pakistanis? Thank you.
Well, terrorists can be no one's friends, and that would be our message to anyone who think that this can be a tool for influence anywhere. And Afghans have always been sovereign, independent-minded people in the country. It will never bend to any kind of pressure in that manner. So I think it's a great opportunity for Pakistan to work with Afghanistan and the United States constructively to end this menace of terrorism, because whether the Pakistanis openly admit to it or not, they are as much a threat to them than anyone else. And it would be in their interest to take this opportunity that has been created by this new South Asia policy to change its ways and work constructively with us to bring stability. It will benefit Pakistan, but we don't want to be the one preaching them on what's in their interest. I think they see it for themselves. What we want to assure them that Afghanistan would never succumb to pressure from foreign terrorist groups as proxies. We have shown our commitment, and I think the world sees it, and we are making that progress. I want to say that this is not the Afghanistan of 2001. People always compare. I think the benchmark is always set at 2001. I think there needs to be a new benchmark. This is a new Afghanistan with new people, with new resources, with new ideas, and without coming to that realization, I think any policy made by anyone would be a failed policy for them.
Hi, Courtney Kuby from NBC News. I just have a quick clarification, Ambassador. You said that there have been 75,000 Afghan casualties, military casualties and police in the last 2 years. Did I hear you correctly?
Correct, yes, 2015 and 16.
That's killed and wounded, right?
Killed and wounded, right? Okay. It's just that's higher than I think we've heard. I think we usually hear much smaller numbers. Can you give us any sense of why that was, or in any area, or can you attribute it to anything that the increase? Thank you.
Well, we saw the largest amount of attacks in 2014, and sort of after the withdrawal of the foreign troops, the vast majority of them. And these attacks started on the Afghan military and went on to civilians attacks that were on our cities. That Taliban got more organized. It did put us in a very difficult position, but it was a test we needed to. I think we have passed. We're happy to be where we are today, and are grateful for the sacrifices of our security forces. Right now, those casualty rates are dropping. I think you may have seen lots of reports in the past 2 years where there are people concerned and worried about the rate of casualties in the country. But that has changed now, that we can prevent the kind of attacks that we were vulnerable to, and are more on the offensive sides of the operations. We can also target when we see large number of people gathering and armed with much more ease. And the capabilities of the Afghan security forces are growing. But I must say we're bracing ourselves for yet a difficult few months or perhaps a year as the Taliban try to deflect the pressure that is put upon them and start targeting urban centers and more attacks inside the urban centers, that they lose areas where they could previously hide. And Absolutely, the airstrikes has been the changing shift here, that shift that has changed that offense, sorry, that defense into an offense. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, right here. Right in the front.
Good to see you again,
Okay,
Ambassador.
You're next. Yeah.
Bobkin. Since your arrival here a few years back, we discovered our mutual interest in the information communications technology sector in Afghanistan. And as you know, the U.S. government has had an interagency team based at both the Kabul embassy and then later at NATO ISAF headquarters from 2004 onwards till the drawdown 14-15. I wanted to let you know that a few months ago, National Defense University Press published a book on that ICT advisory experience for the decade plus in Afghanistan across embassy and ISAF locations and the work with the Ministry of Communications and other entities in country. And then as a question for you, first off, you also mentioned the regional hub concept, and as you well know, the development of fiber, both domestically along the ring road and segments going out to cross-border locations, helps develop transit opportunities and regional integration for telecommunications infrastructure. But on the stabilization and security front, one of our U.S. generals was famous for saying where the roads end in Afghanistan, that is where you see an increase in lack of stabilization and security. And I'd just be interested in your comments on where the telecommunications facilities end in country and elsewhere. How do you see the impact on stabilization and security? Thank you.
Well, the telecommunication sector has been one of the great successes the Afghanistan had. Again, when people compare and their benchmark is 2001, they would say we have millions of telephone users, but internet users that we didn't even that we couldn't even envision then. But I think if we were to set our benchmark at 2014, in just the span of 2 years since 2014 to now, the number of the internet users have doubled by millions. So there are over 6 million people using internet in Afghanistan today via their cell phone, and we didn't even have to go through the traditional or legacy wired methods. They're all through wireless, and it's expanding. Social media use is so huge. There are companies in Afghanistan. There is actually a girls' school in Herat that teaches girls coding. And what they do is the games that they develop, they're putting on the internet, they're putting on the app stores, and are starting to earn revenue out of that. So it has opened new possibilities. It's just the beginning. There are new data centers that are being built, the first in Kabul, and we hope that many others will be built in the country. We have just finished off our open access policy, so foreign investors are starting to look into the Afghan telecommunication sector and the fiber optics itself as an opportunity to invest and start connecting the country through. The possibilities there are endless, and we're trying to take advantage of it as much as we can. And again, when we talk about a new Afghanistan, this is what a new Afghanistan is. 75% of the population is under the age of 35. They grew up at this age of the last 16 years, connected to the world, and they know what they can get out of it, and they are eager to take on the challenge of the rest of the world. They're technologically sophisticated, and I think we see it as an industry that could be a very profitable one, even more than what it is right now.
Time for just 2 more questions.
I'd like to follow up on some of the previous comments on what you're doing to resolve the issue of the Taliban and extremism. What I heard here and what I've been hearing a lot seems to be treatment and not the cure. What I mean by that is military strikes of some form or the other, giving the U.S. free rein to carry out strikes now without permission, does that solve the core of why the, now you're calling them irreconcilables, will continue to their mission? And if not, which I don't believe it will solve the core of the problem, what can be done to solve the core, to prevent either the irreconcilables or the reconcilables from doing what they're doing and thinking the way they think? And I know opening the door is one way, but that might not be enough. I mean, you're announcing, come to the table. Does that really change the mind of a person who is willing to attack in Afghanistan? So what, in addition to the treatments that I've been hearing, which a lot of which are military reactions, what else can be done so that you don't have to use these tactics in response to the crimes that are called terrorist acts? Could you share your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. One of the, I understand Washington is very military-centric these days, and because of the engagement with Afghanistan and what it has been, a war, it's obvious that there is that kind of focus. But we just had the First Lady of Afghanistan come in a couple of weeks ago, and one of the reasons we brought her here was to take the discussion to the more human aspect of this. There are Afghans who are hurting from the, it's one thing to talk about Taliban, Daesh, and all the extremists and what we're doing to do the fight, but it's also important to understand that the government, or at least from the Afghan government's perspective, the buck doesn't stop there. We're doing much more on the human side of it. The government has citizen-centric policies. One of our projects that is the core of our stabilization operations is called the Citizens Charter, which is an addition to the NSP, the National Solidarity Program, that was only in rural areas and only used the rural rehabilitation budget to provide, to engage communities to build. Now we've opened that to all of government, so the Ministry of Education has entered into the Ministry of Agriculture and other ministries that also provide services to the citizens in order to attract them and to build their trust with the government. But there are other things that the government is also doing that don't get much attention because they're sophisticated, they're complicated processes that are not simply calling the Taliban to come to the negotiation table, and that is on what are the specific grievances in each one of the Afghan districts where there is insecurity. Some are because of militias, private militias that were run in the past, and we are addressing those, which is then leading to the causes of some of the political opposition who are making rhetorical statements to say that the government is weak or trying to weaken that process. And that is directly in retaliation to the reform efforts that are happening. There are other areas, other districts that are purely, whose grievances are economical. And for that, the Afghan government is addressing as it may be. So the government is doing most of this work, and this is the Afghan government's work. In support, there is support for it from our international partners, but this is the Afghan government taking a lead in eradicating any reasons that may be for people to be sympathetic or support any of the insurgents groups or terrorists.
And we have time for just one more in the back corner there.
Ambassador, thanks very much. Jeff Selden from Voice of America. You were talking about some of the efforts that you've undertaken in Afghanistan to cure or get to the root of the problems with terrorism. Specifically wondering, though, about Daesh, why they've been so persistent right now, and why, despite all the efforts by both Afghanistan and the U.S. government to eradicate Daesh there, why they continue to hang on and continue to seem to have good numbers. Are they coming from within Afghanistan themselves? Are they coming from other areas? Anything you could expand on that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Well, the large number of Daesh fighters are foreign fighters. They come with their own ideology, and they have a small number of Afghans within, but they could have been much bigger if we didn't take such a strong measure right from the start in 2014, later in 15 when they started arising. And there are several fractures that have also started to appear inside the Daesh forces in Afghanistan, where they're fighting amongst each other. But they are a threat because they're so brutal. But it's also because the Taliban, some of the factions that are going on to continue, some of the irreconcilable elements that are more extreme are also joining Daesh, some because it's an opportunity, others their own internal conflicts. But the brutality will continue to increase, and that is why we need to address this so rapidly, because the more the more time it takes, the more radical some of these groups become, and their ideologies start to sync with one another.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for giving us your time today, and thank you all for sticking it out to the very end, and please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you to our partners, ASU, University of Texas, and the Global Soft Foundation. And thank you in particular also to Albert Ford, who was instrumental in making this happen. Also to Morgan and Simone, who are sitting back in our production facility. David Sturman, Amanda Cooley's, Clara Allen, Ethan. Thank you all for coming and for being with us throughout the day.